Right. Well, it's a strange individualism though, because it's based again on what you might describe as maximization of short-term identity. It's sort of the claim is I can be whoever I want, and all social regulation of that is nothing but an imposition, which is really not true at all, because most of the time following social principles allows you to form relationships with other people and opens up horizons of opportunity to you. That's the benefit of sacrificing not exactly individuality, but short-term individual whim. And it's something that children learn as they mature, right? They can't get everything they want right now, but the payoff for that is that they can get along with other people and that things work better over the long run. And that I would say, understanding that and then abiding by that principle of medium to long-term well-being is something like maturation. And this individualism that you're describing isn't really, I don't think it's really, it's not an enlightened individualism because it's too short term. It's more like, well, I am whatever I feel I am right at this moment. And to me, that smacks of, well, nothing more than, in some real sense, like a 2-year-old immaturity. And I mean that technically, because 2-year-olds are very whim-oriented, very, very short term, and very self-centered. They can't play with other people. And so you have the dissolution of identity, right? There's no community, no real community, not in terms of community organization, but also not in terms of real face-to-face friendships and interactions. There's no participation in religious enterprises. There's no real reading about political or philosophical matters. There's a decline in spirituality. So there's a real collapse of sophisticated identity. And all of this, well, the sexualization of identity seems to me to be, in some sense, what would you say, a replacement for that or a reaction to that? Does that seem on point to you, or am I missing something there?
Well, I think you're correct in that some of those elements of individualism are much more short term and not as deeply seated, in terms of religion and meaning, and more focus on some of the short term. But I think lesbian and gay and bisexual identity is not really an example of that, because that seems to be more deeply seated and constant for most people. That does seem to be a much more long-term identity. So that I think is not as much on the part of individualism having to do with that, the self-focus. It's more around accepting difference and accepting people for who they are, and taking some of the more traditional social rules and saying, these don't really recognize people as individuals and for who they are. And that might be different. It might not be in the majority, but that's who they are as people.
Well, you talked in your book in Generation Me, you talked about the self-esteem movement. And self-esteem has always been a particular bugbear of mine, I would say, especially since I discovered that psychometrically it was basically composed of low neuroticism with a bit of extroversion thrown in. And so self-esteem is a proxy for neuroticism in many, many ways. And it isn't obvious to me at all that you treat neuroticism by treating people to be more self-centered. One of the things I used to do with my clients who were socially anxious, say, when they'd go into a social situation, they'd start obsessing about how they were appearing to other people. They'd fall into that trap, and then they'd stop making eye contact, and then they would get awkward, and then they would engage in non sequiturs, and the whole conversation would grind to a halt. And I asked them instead to concentrate as hard as they could on putting the other person at ease. And that gave them something to think about other than themselves. And so the self-esteem movement was predicated on the idea that people high in neuroticism had low self-esteem, which I don't think was true at all, and that the right remediation for that was to treat everyone as if they were uniquely special. So it was like narcissism was the antidote to neuroticism. Right. And that's
right.
It's so appalling.
It doesn't work.
No. In fact, it makes it much worse. And so
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, I'm relieved to hear that your sentiments are in keeping with that formulation.
Ha 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 ha. Arrow. Ha 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 ha. Love, Grandpa.
a generous gift.